Hi, everyone. Um, Welcome to our session. I'm so glad that we can all come together to talk about one of my favorite topics, data in the nonprofit sector. So before we begin, I want to frame the conversation we will be having today. And I hope that this really contextualizes how we as a sector think about, understand, and use data. Our speakers today will touch on relevant digital and data strategies that may impact your organization, its participants, and your community. I'm going to start the discussion today by sharing an exciting new O&N project, the DEAL strategy. And then we will hear from Jessie Campbell from the Ontario Digital Service and Titi Akinsumni, also from the Ontario Digital Service, who will speak to Ontario's digital ID. Christopher Mastropietro from the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, and Mike Lenzner from Powered by Data, /AJA. So once the presenters have spoken, we can open the floor for questions, comments, and general discussion. Just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen because I've put together a little PowerPoint presentation for us today. Can I just get a head nod from the panelists that you guys can see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so the DEAL strategy stands for data evaluation. Data evaluation and learning strategy. What it basically focuses on is how do we as a sector systematically share information, data, research, and evaluation across networks. The strategy builds on the work of the Data Policy Coalition. The way that we're approaching this is by building and developing a sector-wide strategy that would include steering committee, strategy development, key decision makings around governance tools, building out some resources, supporting platforms, and general engagement. Obviously, we can't do this without the sector itself. So we're looking on convening the sector on data, research, and evaluation issues and projects, liaising with stakeholders such as funding bodies on aligning data and reporting requirements. We also want to strengthen the bond between the nonprofit sector and research and development. So around that, we want to encourage and support and grow sector-led, partnered research, develop a research agenda for the sector, and help disseminate best practices. We also want to support community-governed platforms and infrastructure. With the help of our friends at Powered by Data /AJA, we want to build a grants data portal and build and extend data sharing initiatives. And lastly, we also want to advocate and educate on public policy. We want to continue to liaise with non-government funders on aligning data and reporting requirements. So these last 2 years, these pandemic years, has really showcased the need for Ontario's nonprofit sector to better organize itself around research, data, and evaluation. So while individual nonprofits may produce their own reports and evaluations, the sector as a whole does not yet have the collective platforms to review, and dialogue on their internal data and reports. Additionally, barriers faced by the nonprofit sector limits their capacity to create better supports and services, participate in public policy discussions, and actively impact outcomes in their communities. That is a crux of why we're doing this work. As you all know, ONN is and has always been really invested in setting out good principles to start to work. And so our principles, which are outlined here, is to ensure that the Ontario's nonprofit sector's data is ethically used and appropriately leveraged to support learning and decision-making. So we know that the development of data and knowledge must be equity-focused, rights-based, democratically governed, decentralized, and participatory. Knowledge development and mobilization must involve frontline practitioners and those with lived experience. And the initiative must build confidence and capacity in the nonprofit sector in terms of data and information management. Last slide. So how do we want to do this? What is our next steps going to look like? So our next steps will be to establish a steering committee. And we're going to take our time to do that because we want to make sure that it's representative and that it is that aligns with the values that we've outlined. We're also going to continue doing what we have already been doing, which is connecting people, projects, and initiatives that are doing similar work, learning from them, and showcasing those learnings and resources. We're also going to continue to engage the sector and build inroads for sector-academia dialogue. We're also going to stay in conversation with both government and non-government funders. So, with all that said, I wanted to give everybody a sense of the work that's going on behind the scenes, and I'm going to pass it over to Jessie Campbell.
Thank you so much, Maria. I hope you can hear me all right. I know my speaker is a little quiet, so I'll just try to project. But yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Really happy to be here this afternoon to talk about some of the data work I've been involved in at my time at the Ontario Digital Service, which is part of the Ministry of Finance and the Ontario government. So thanks so much for having me and my colleagues here today. I just wanted to start off by saying it's a really exciting time for the topic of data in Ontario. There's lots of new opportunities. There's lots of learning that we're doing from other governments. And also COVID has really put a spotlight on the importance of data access. So a lot of great stuff happening. Ontario also just recently got its first dedicated Associate Minister of Digital Government, Khalid Rashid, in June of 2021. Along with a new Associate Minister of Digital Government, the Ontario government actually released its very first digital and data strategy earlier this year in the spring. And I was actually part of the team that helped write that strategy and do the consultations to support it. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that strategy before I jump into talking a little bit more about one of the strategy's key initiatives, which is Ontario Data Authority. So the digital data strategy is called Building a Digital Ontario. And as I mentioned, it was just released this spring, and it's really about laying the groundwork for the province to become a world-leading digital jurisdiction. So the strategy is a response to nearly 2 years of consultations that the government did. We talked to the public, we talked to individuals, communities, and organizations, as well as businesses across the province, including the nonprofit sector. So we heard a lot of different things about the different digital and data challenges that face different stakeholders across the province. And really, one of the key themes we heard that helped shape the strategy is that stakeholders really want to see new forms of access to high quality, high valuable government data. And they believe this data can help them with data-driven decision making, as well as stimulating economic and social growth. We also heard, though, that transparency transparency is really, really important. So stakeholders want to see that government's data practices and data management is done in a transparent, ethical way. And above and beyond that, we also heard the importance of having really strong, secure digital infrastructure to support new forms of data sharing. So that's a little bit on the strategy, and it also, I would encourage anyone who's interested to go on to Ontario.ca and look it up and maybe browse the strategy and read more about it. So above and beyond kind of the initiatives that are in it, the strategy also points forward some foundational building blocks that are really essential to drive Ontario's digital growth. So we discussed things like enabling participation in the digital economy, strong privacy, security, and trust, that piece around access to high quality data, and also more convenient, reliable, and accessible government services. So yeah, encourage everyone to take a look. Any questions there? No? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard someone. And yeah, so above and beyond the kind of policy enablers and the path forward that's outlined in the strategy, there was a series of new initiatives announced in the strategy as well. And one of those is a new data authority. So this is a policy project that I've been involved in, and it's really a data access initiative project. It's looking at how the province can start to form more responsible data stewardship practices that will complement the province's current open data work, but we'll also kind of focus on how do we start to unlock access to other forms of high value public sector data that are not yet available to users and to the public. So it's really about looking at how we unlock new high value data and we can integrate it in new ways. So a bit more of a deeper dive on the authority project. It's definitely very much in an early policy development phase. We're really looking at what other governments are doing, and we know places like Australia and the EU are really forward thinking and are looking at legislative, technological, and program level improvements to increase data sharing. So we've been actively researching and looking at how other countries are really tackling this challenge, because we're all all governments are kind of being faced by this challenge of leveraging data in more smart ways. So essentially, the project, its vision is about responsible modern data infrastructure that will support social and economic growth. So a little bit more on the project for those who are interested. We have started doing some stakeholder and public sector engagement this summer, and we're really at the phase where we're analyzing a lot of the feedback that we've heard and figuring out how to drive the project forward. Overall, we've heard a lot of support and excitement around the province developing its own new data authority. We've heard a lot about the critical importance of, having ethical approaches to responsible approaches to data use. Also have heard a lot about the importance of oversight and accountability for a new data authority. And of course, the privacy and security piece is absolutely critical as well. So we're really taking our time to understand stakeholder feedback to date, looking at jurisdictional research and continuing to build our approach out. So yeah, it's really exciting, definitely early days in the project, but we just, we're excited to move forward. And that being said, I think, we've heard a little bit from the nonprofit sector so far, and we're really, really excited to continue to hear from the nonprofit sector. We know the nonprofit sector are extensive users of government data, and so equitable access is very important. And we've also seen that highlighted through COVID. So definitely more opportunities for public and sector engagement as the project moves forward. We'll certainly be sharing updates about the project on Ontario.ca. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the project. We'd be more than happy to talk about it. So thanks again so much for having me, and I guess I'll pass it back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you for that great overview, Jessie. I noticed that there are some links in the chat to better explore the data, the Ontario data strategy. And I'm going to now introduce Titi.
Thank you, Nimari. Good afternoon to everyone. As my colleague has said, a lot of the work that's been done at the Ontario Digital Service is very much geared towards being able to make Ontario one of the leading jurisdictions when it comes to the use, adoption, and rollout of digital overall. I am going to be speaking to you this afternoon very briefly on our focus, our work around, our program around digital identity in Ontario. If there are any questions, myself, I will be waiting to be able to respond to it. I'll be able to preface 3 quick things. So if you remember nothing else that I speak this afternoon, remember these 3 things around the vision around digital identity in Ontario. It's this: the goal is for you to be able to leave your wallet at home, to guard against identity theft, and to ensure that you can securely access services at any time from anywhere. I'm a firm believer in making no assumptions. So I will tell you that when we talk about digital identity as the Ontario Public Service, we're talking about a set of secure credentials that you can store on your devices. So in the same way that you carry your government ID, your driver's license or health card, whichever it is, you'll be able to carry your digital ID on your phone and use it wherever, whenever you need to. And that the reusable ID credentials will let you verify your identity without you having to share your data on an ongoing basis. Your digital ID will be in your hands, under your control, with encryption that protects you from fraud, tampering, or identity theft. And instantly, with my privacy hat on, I have questions, that how am I going to ensure that this is actually consistently secure? Now, our goal within the ODS is that we will be driving adoption of online services, yes, across the province, but our goal is to ensure that it will be efficient and it will only happen with improved security. So if I just shift that scenario again for you, now you carry multiple ID cards. Our goal is data, secure, private, and in your control, right? Giving Ontarians a trusted government issue ID in digital formats with easy access, contactless, quick, convenient, and easy to use. A safer, more secure option. To speak to the biggest concerns that people typically, have in their minds around the opportunities and considerations around digital identity. One is this: privacy is critical, it's paramount. Your personal data will be kept private. Your digital IDs will be kept safe, secure, and it can be trusted because we are putting in place really secure processes and protocols and infrastructure that will ensure this. Digital IDs and related services will consistently continue to be useful, and it will meet the needs of Ontario's people and businesses, leaving nobody behind. Digital IDs also will give you more choice by enabling more convenience, accessible services online without replacing existing physical IDs for those who choose to continue to use them or to have them. In building out the digital identity initiative, and Jesse also referenced this in the work around digital data authorities in general, we have been having, an ongoing series of consultations over the last 2 years. In this year alone, in this summer alone, we have not only consulted with the private sector, we have also consulted with the public sector, with individuals across board. We have consulted with groups that typically might be considered as being outside of the digital space. The consultation data we now have comes from roundtables, focus groups, online surveys that were analyzed to model and understand the drivers of adoption to inform our eventual design and to help Ontario realize the $20 billion value that lies in going digital. One of the data sets I can share with you is this, that 80% of Ontario's population indicate that they will adopt digital ID over the first 5 years of its being put into place. Having shared all of that, I'd love to be able to hand it back to the host, and again, available for any questions that you might have around to ensure that we can continue to have a simpler, better, faster services for Ontarians. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Titi. I think my colleague Liz added a link to the chat for more information on the Ontario Digital ID. So I'm going to pass it over to Christopher, and I do see a question, and we'll address questions at the end.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody. So this follows actually quite nicely from Jesse and TT, because this is all about privacy. I am part of a policy team at the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. Historically, what we do is we have kind of policy custody or leadership over Ontario's privacy statutes that relate to the public sector, that being the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and its municipal equivalent. And aside from providing a right to access of information in government, what those statutes do is they establish certain requirements for public sector organizations when it comes to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. And that applies both to provincial ministries, but it also applies to a wide variety of public sector organizations, school boards, hospitals, municipal organizations, libraries, police service boards, you name it. It's fairly encompassing, and the umbrella keeps getting broader over the course of time as more institutions get scheduled to it. But there's been an interesting shift over the last few years in our policy shop, as well as in the bigger picture, because we started to turn our attention more to private sector privacy, which is something that in Ontario is ungoverned by any kind of provincial law. Many of you will probably be familiar with this. Right now in Canada, we have a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to private sector privacy. We have a national regime, a federal statute called PIPEDA, the Provincial Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act. Sorry, folks, these acronyms come fast and loose. I'll try and keep them under control. And what that does is it establishes privacy requirements for commercial organizations that are engaged in some kind of commercial activity. Now, as you can imagine, that excludes quite a huge slice of the pie here in Canada, and the nonprofit sector being probably the most conspicuous exclusion. There are a couple of provinces, aside from Ontario, outside of Ontario, I should say, that have equivalent laws that apply to those particular provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec, namely. And a couple of those have laws that actually do apply to a wider scope of organizations that would include nonprofits. But this is a big question right now in Canadian privacy law as to how the scope of these laws are defined, who's included and who's not. Now, the shift in the last couple of years, I'm trying to give you a little bit of a background here before I go a little bit more intensively into what Ontario is doing or thinking about. Okay, so just sort of bear with me. A few years ago, there was a big shift in international privacy that came from Europe. That was the introduction of a law called the General Data Protection Regulation. And what that did is sort of a rising tide of privacy law. And what it did is it introduced far more robust protections for personal information and establish more of a rights-based approach to the control of personal information. And it's quite global in that law, meaning that it applies to just about every kind of organization, whether they're private or public. And so it's very encompassing, and it became very famous very quickly for two reasons, really. One is that it introduced some very robust data rights, for instance, like the right that's most famously known as the right to be forgotten or data erasure or de-indexing, the right of data portability, which is essentially to get an extract of your own information and port it over to another organization, another company, for instance, that you want to change your client relationship with, and a variety of other different rights associated with the use of AI technology. The other thing that made it quite famous is that it introduced some very, very significant fines for contravention of that law, fines upwards in the millions of euros. And that created quite a ripple. And once that was introduced, that sort of became, I'm simplifying this a little bit, but that became effectively a kind of new gold standard for privacy globally, and all kinds of other jurisdictions, Canada included, have been trying to update their privacy regimes to be adequate with that law, so that international trade agreements and all kinds of other factors aren't disrupted and upended by the imbalance of protections from one place to another. So all of that has been happening at the federal level in Canada. Canada has been working to update that federal privacy regime, which has been in place for about 20 years now. And last year, they came out with an example of that, which was a bill to do just that, to basically introduce some new, more robust protections and to bring Canada's privacy regime, I suppose, into the 21st century properly, given that the data environment is so incredibly complex. There was quite a vocal reaction to that bill, and the fate of it is quite unknown at this point because its progress through the House of Commons was disrupted by the election. And we know that because of this same adequacy reason, they're going to have to introduce it at some point again, but we don't exactly know when, and we don't exactly know what this new version will contain. Okay, so meanwhile, what are we doing in Ontario? So for the last couple of years, we've been undertaking some consultations to try and think aloud about the prospect of introducing privacy requirements in Ontario for the private sector, especially given that, and this is particularly relevant, I think, to you folks, that federal regime cannot, for all kinds of constitutional reasons, and because of the limitations of its sort of founding conditions, cannot apply itself to the nonprofit space. It can't apply itself to non-commercial activities, non-commercial organizations. And that's a big gap, as you can imagine, when it comes to individual privacy. So one thing that we've been thinking about is, what would it mean to introduce a regime in Ontario that would try and fill the gaps and round out the edges of that federal regime and take it up a notch in terms of providing some more robust protections, right? Making sure that things like non-commercial activities or employee information, things like children and youth protection, things like more significant protections for the use of automated decision-making systems and other forms of AI technologies, all of these things that are not addressed so directly or perhaps not sufficiently by the federal regime could be filled in by a provincial one that would be attentive to those gaps and fill them to make sure that the protections of privacy are as strong as we can possibly make them. As you can imagine, it's a very tall order because privacy traditionally has been a very delicate balancing act. It balances individual interests and individual citizen interests, I mean to say, with organizations' interests, especially when they sometimes are at variance with one another. It also balances the need for strong, robust protections with the need to make sure that there is enough flexibility for organizations not to be impeded when they're trying to deliver important services. Making sure that the protections are strong, but don't introduce so much undue burden that organizations are actually harmed in the process of us trying to make sure that individuals are protected, especially now, obviously, in this sort of COVID context or post-COVID context, where a lot of organizations are strapped and suffering to begin with. The last thing we want to do is introduce anything that's going to impede the recovery of the province writ large. So we undertook a consultation, a couple, in fact, the most recent of which was this past summer. And that culminated in a white paper being published on the registry. In fact, I'm just going to post a link to that in the chat here for anyone who might be interested in taking a look at that. And what we did is we introduced a series of themes under the heading of private sector privacy and asked a bunch of questions about, what kind of protections should the province need? Should we proceed with an Ontario bill that would try and fill in those gaps that are opened by the federal regime? And if so, how far should we go under these themes? How far should these protections go? Where should we draw the line? How should we scope these requirements? It's far too detailed for me to go into it now, but I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a look. We welcome all feedback. The Ontario Nonprofit Network has already provided us very generously with some very, very thoughtful feedback that we've been considering very closely, along with dozens and dozens of other submissions from organizations across the province. We've been talking to a lot of folks about this, industry, experts, you name it. And it's been an incredibly rich process. It's been an embarrassment of riches, really. The next steps are really unclear. We don't know what this is going to mean. We know that it's very important to organizations to have harmony and alignment between the jurisdictions, especially with the federal regime, because we don't want to be sowing a dissonant or disorderly situation whereby organizations are having to comply with different requirements and being confused in the process. And we don't want to introduce needless burden. At the same time, we want to make sure that protections are meaningful and that they try and pave the way forward so that as technology becomes more innovative within the province, we have the corresponding safeguards and guardrails to make sure that that innovation is commensurate with protection. So I'll leave it there. I'll welcome questions afterwards when we open it up. But yet again, thank you very much for being here, and thanks for the welcome. And I'll pass it back to the host.
Thank you, Christopher. That was very interesting, and I really appreciate the thoroughness of your explanation and the contextualizing that you did there. That was great. Last but not least, we have Michael Lenzner from AJA/Powered by Data, and I'm going to let him take it away.
Thanks, Marie. Could you remind me, Marie, of how long I should be speaking for?
Yeah, you have about, I'd say, 10 minutes. 5 to 10.
Just setting a watch. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for ONN for the invitation to speak or to share the panel with the fellow panelists. I'm going to share just a little bit about how we're thinking about data, and there's a lot of there's some new ideas, I'm sure, for some people today, just shared from participants already, and ONN has already I think shared information over the years on open data, on administrative data, on new evaluation tools. So I'm going to share what I work in data in the nonprofit sector full time, and I'll share a couple ideas about how I'm thinking this through, how we're thinking this through at our organizations, at AJA and at Powered by Data. The three areas are open data, admin data, and infrastructure. For us are the three groupings. And just to back up for the introduction, so AJA is I'm the CEO of AJA, a for-profit company. We launched in 2010, and we were working on the question of who funds who, and offering a service there. And then we launched a nonprofit on the nonprofit initiative, to be clear, on the Tides platform, now the Make Way platform, that's Powered by Data. And the social mission, or the mission of Powered by Data, is to help nonprofits access the information they need to be able to, or access information that will help them accomplish their mission. And it's not a full service. It's very much just working on that access question. And we've had great participation with ONN over the years, and Liz on looking into that question, and our Data Policy Coalition. So yeah, we started off working on this, started off working on the open data question. And again, and I have colleagues here, I think that are listening in that are open data colleagues I've worked with. And open data is basically, non-information, not about individuals, or if it's about individuals, it's about MPs, it's about, it's personal information about people that, as a part of their public role, have a public persona, not about private individuals. And open data works well for sectors that have a lot of interaction with government. So the nonprofit sector, there's still a lot of potential and opportunity with open data. And for the nonprofit sector, because government possesses a lot of data about the nonprofit sector by virtue of providing a significant amount of its funding, and also in regulating it. If you compare this to the fashion industry, there's less data that would be available from government about open data on the fashion industry, or on other sectors of the economy. In that, that's the area that we started working on, that we were looking at, questions of who funds who, question about what are nonprofits working on, questions of how many nonprofits are there in Canada. So, you know, the number that we hear of 160,000 nonprofits in Canada from charitable and nonprofits, that's a guesstimate that's pretty old now, and that's pretty long in the tooth. And to revise that information, to know that information, we'd have to look through the incorporation registries of each province where they incorporate, where nonprofits can either incorporate provincially or federally. So that data sits at provincial data sets and in one federal data set. And we need to merge that information. And then we need to exclude the information about nonprofits that do not have a social purpose. An example of that could be a social club, or an example of that could also be a nonprofit that a few companies have set up where they share some costs on advertising, let's say, for a market, where they all pay into that, and then that nonprofit, it's not a social purpose nonprofit. So there's still work to be done there to leverage this open data that provinces have and the feds have, to be able to answer the question of how many nonprofits are there in Canada, and what are their names and what are their addresses. Obviously, we have people here on the call that do a bunch of that work with Find Help here, and I think we have Ontario 2-on-1 on the call too, that answer those questions and answer those questions manually and spend significant time and effort so that we have answers to those questions, but of services. But there is open data can play a role in that, and to lighten the load for those organizations. Something, you know, there's a development on that 2 weeks ago, where for the first time now, you in Ontario can look up, you have access to your own public registry of incorporated organizations. And that's a big change. That exists already in Quebec and PEI and at the federal level, but Ontario, you couldn't search for an organization and see that it was incorporated provincially up till 2 weeks ago, and now you can do that. And the reason you couldn't do that up till 2 weeks ago, because the government had a contract with a private organization that managed that incorporation process, and government paid a part of that money and then let the private company, I understand it, maybe I have this wrong, but the company had would resell information as a way of minimizing costs to taxpayers. And so I think that has been revised, and now instead of charging for that information, the entity and the corporation that manages the incorporation registry now doesn't have the possibility to generate revenue, but the information is now public. And so I think, I imagine the contract had to be reviewed for that. The other opportunity, an interesting opportunity for open data is also just to get access to the awarded grants data information. So we've had success at Barbie Data, and we lobbied for that information. Probably 4 years ago or 5 years ago, asking the federal government to say, to give us, to not keep us, but to share publicly information about who funded who. And that information now sits in a data set at the federal government, and you can look through it, and it has information about the business number of the recipient and the purposes of the grant. There's an opportunity to get that information from the province of Ontario. That information currently isn't made available about what grants the provincial government is giving out. There's a couple ministries that share some of that information, but I think there's probably more missing than there is available. And so that's a great opportunity that's still on the table. Anyways, that's something around open data. Admin data is something that we've been working putting more energy into in the last several years. I am still learning with the data authority, so it's great to have people here telling us about it. We've had some great interactions with ONN, learning about the different initiatives the province is up to. This question of data that the government has, which there could create business value or social value from it, it seems clear to my understanding that that's a priority for government to make that information available. And I know there's extreme interest in making that information available for social purposes and for business purposes. It's not clear to me that the government has identified the nonprofit sector as a significant stakeholder in that. Researchers seem to be a major stakeholder, and and the private sector seems to be major stakeholder. And not, I appreciate this engagement from government to come and not wanting to put anyone on blast. But there's a question about whether in the nonprofit sector we are able to really communicate effectively our needs around how private information that's held by the government of Ontario could be leveraged ethically for socially good causes. And so it's a complicated subject, it's a delicate subject, there's major concerns in it. There's lots of potential for bad things to happen. Bad things have happened in the past around private information held by government. But there's probably a role for the nonprofit sector, and the Data Policy Coalition has been engaged in that discussion, which has been wonderful. I'm so excited that will continue with O&M. I think I'll put a link in after to the social data linkage environment, or maybe Liz, you could do that. That's a tool that the federal government has, where the federal government is pulling in provincial and federal data from different ministries, different departments, and making it available through this tool. They do keep a very low profile about what they're working on. So not too many people know about it, but it's very interesting to look at that tool and imagine possibilities with it. And there are nonprofits that are using that infrastructure to be able to learn about the outcomes of their clients. So instead of having indicators about potentially how our clients are doing, how can we access the information about what the outcomes are 5 years, 10 years down the line? And yes, it doesn't tell contribution, it doesn't tell our impact necessarily, but at least this finds out the outcomes in a low-cost manner, which is interesting, a relatively low-cost manner. And then maybe just I'll take another minute, Marie. Sorry. The question of infrastructure, that's something, that we're working on with OTF, with O&M on what is there a need for infrastructure, for shared services, for shared infrastructure in our sector? What does that need? And what are the conditions under which we could go about that work in the right way? And by infrastructure, we've all heard there's a push to use the SDGs as a chance to get our data together and be able to have the reporting that we need to learn more about or share more information about social conditions in Canada, to aggregate that information. It's not clear to me how well we're doing or where that initiative is, the push toward the SDGs in Canada. Before that, there was the push to use the Canadian Index of Wellbeing to have information about background conditions that we could evaluate ourselves against. I don't know if the status of that project, if that's moving forward in the same way, but when you think of these large technological projects that would impact lots of us and wouldn't be things we each develop on our own, to think through what does the sector need and how do we really engage in those questions where we're driving the bus more. And I would say it's important to question the metaphors we have a little bit with this stuff. So privacy, we have a strong understanding of privacy, but there's another way of looking at this information, which we've heard from key stakeholders, which is the right to privacy directly pushes against the right to be counted. And the right to be counted is a real thing from social advocates that are dealing with very, very vulnerable populations. And so it suggests different ways of understanding this. And the question of how to share information about evaluations, how to share information about best practices, the other way of flipping that is to say, how is the nonprofit sector unintentionally contributing to suppressing data? So I think there's a question there. Someone join me.
Mike, you have to turn your mic back on.
Thanks, sorry. That was the last thing. I think I censored myself talking about unintentionally suppressing data. So it's not a question of bad actors, but a question of, how do we make sure the information that is needed for us, for the social conditions to improve, how do we make sure that's there and that we're not unintentionally perpetuating, missed opportunities? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. I think you've given us all a lot to think about, which happens literally every time we talk. So, so there are some questions, and it sounded like there may have been, a reaction at or a question that somebody had. So we can take more questions, just drop them into the chat. We did have one, I think it was intended for TT. Is the intention that digital ID is only usable for government services?
Thank you, Nimari, and thank you for that question. So just to take a step back, digital ID has an amazing range of use cases that's applicable. Now, understanding that, one of the things that the team has been very clear about in delivery is being able to phase out actual rollout or even the development of products. So in simple terms, to answer your question, is the intention for it to be for only government services? No. However, the product, the program that's been developed is in a phased way such that we respond to and deliver based on government services. And then based on series of continuing consultations, legal authority, etc., we will land in a place whether that will happen or not. But those are considerations for the future. They are not currently in place right now.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions, comments from the participants? Feel free to put any questions in Feedloop or in Zoom. Okay, well, while you guys think about all of this information, I know there's a lot of it and there was a lot of acronyms. One thing that, I've been mulling about, and I think Mike talked really eloquently to this, and so any panelists can jump in, is on what data sets are useful to nonprofit sector. I think we've heard from Mike about having data sets that help us understand the sector more deeply, be able to produce some information about the sector as a whole or in Ontario. But I'm wondering, is there other oh, okay. Well, I'll ask my question, and then Pam, Pamela Johnson, I see your question as well. I'm wondering if there's other things that, other data sets that could be of use.
Maria, I'm just holding myself back from because I already answered a bit of that. I'm not sure if the other panelists can speak to that or not. It's maybe less of a government question.
Yeah, I would love. I can speak to it as well. Of course, I would be very interested to hear what other types of data, like above administrative data and other types of social data would be of interest to the sector. Yeah, we're always looking for insights on that. But we'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts.
I think some has been shared or is being shared on the Zoom. So thank you for that. One of the questions that we had was, could speakers provide a few more practical implications we might see day to day in our organizations?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit from my end of things, which is about, this is sort of a future conditional statement, right? If Ontario were to introduce privacy law, and if it were to contain the various features that we've contemplated, what would that mean hypothetically? And there are many. I mean, that's one of the reasons why this issue has become hotly debated, and that's why there's very little consensus, because the provision of privacy protections comes with a certain amount of burden and to organizations, and there's no getting around that. It's just about how much the burden is warranted based on the protections provided. So, for instance, a couple of examples: the introduction of data rights, things like the right to erasure the right to be forgotten, which is a right of de-indexing, the right of data portability, which is to be able to transfer your data, the right of access and correction, right, to be able to get a copy of your own information from an organization. All of those rights come with associated requirements for the organization, right? So that means that an organization would have to be able to respond to those kinds of requests. If you got a request in for someone to be able to ask for their own information to be provided, or to have their information be removed or deleted or de-identified, which is sort of a technical term for when information is dissociated from anything that could source it back to a named individual, right? Those would all be rights and requirements that an organization potentially would have to comply with. There would also be things like transparency requirements. So an organization might have to develop a privacy management program, a set of internal policies that would govern how they use personal information. It might mean that they have to comply with notice requirements, meaning if they're transferring information to another party, like a service provider or over a border, or they're doing any number of specific activities with it, they might have to provide a notice to the person whose information it is to say, hey, just so you know, we're going to be doing this with your information. We're letting you know that we might have the authority to do it, but we're providing you with a notice that this is happening so that we're fully transparent, so that you're in the loop, and so that you have more control over your data in the process. So there are all kinds of things that an organization might have to equip itself to be able to do if those kinds of requirements were introduced. Now, with that comes all kinds of other, questions about, well, what kind of resources would organizations be provided with to help them? How long would they be given to make sure that they could kind of get up to speed? And the imposition of those requirements might have, there might be a sliding scale of burden depending on how big the organization is, how many people, how complex the data is that you work with, that kind of thing. So it's incredibly variable, but those are just sort of some examples, at least from a private sector privacy angle.
Thank you.
Just add to Chris's point. So I think when I think about the digital and data strategy that I talked about at the start of the hour, there's all kinds of initiatives, in there that do impact individuals. It kind of showcases a bunch of work happening across government, from infrastructure and investments in broadband to changes to the STEM curriculum and education. So a lot of different initiatives there kind of speak to enhancing digital skills, supporting Ontarians so that they can be more competitive, or just kind of interact in the digital economy that we find ourselves in. Increasingly, we're all doing business online, we're all learning online, so really looking at some of those social supports that can speak to different needs that Ontarians have across the spectrum of privacy and education and that. So that's kind of one real world connection. And I think in terms of the data authority too, we're still at such an early phase with it, but ideally the end state is, of course, increased access to public sector data for organizations and for individuals to make better decisions that affect their lives. So the goal is ultimately better access, but also stronger rules of the road, stronger governance frameworks, and also that digital infrastructure piece too. So longer term, but I just want to mention that as well, those kind of real world impacts.
Thank you both so much. I think we have about 7 minutes. So, and there's 2 more questions. So I'll go ahead and ask them. One was, is there a subsector or group of organizations among the nonprofit sector that you think have been able to leverage data really well to make an impact? And Mike, I'm going to be honest, I feel like this might be a question for you.
Cool. There's definitely subsectors have strategies, and those strategies, one great thing about our work is we get to see how different subsectors do things similarly and how they do things differently. I think there's not a lot of work on this, but I think the subsectors where there's shared case management tools, there's this built-in or enforced information sharing that I think probably has a different impact, has different, certainly changes, certainly changes how data works and the accessibility of data versus organizations that are not forced by nature of their funding agreement to be using a shared case management software or a dedicated or dictated case management software. So I think that's a big difference when we talk about digital transformation. We talk about using data. I think the idea of having access to shared information from your peers, from other people doing work in the same space, maybe it's not even super detailed, but that pool of data exists. I think there's interesting work there. Or I think that's a major difference. So, with homelessness, there's certainly HIFIS is there's shared information sharing there. And it's just a space we're continuing to work on and thinking about how those change things and change who's asking questions, who's answering questions, kind of thing. But it's interesting. And then the fields that are closer to medicine, have the approach, has the kind of medical approach, and $1 billion was spent in Ontario on clinical, on e-files for health records. So that people that are in mental health kind of are influenced very much by the way in which research is done in the medical community, in the medical area. And so I think there's significant differences there. As individual organizations, I know Pathways Education does work. I know that employment, there's a major project with employment data to look at our pathways to employment. And if you think about, that's a sector where there is shared case management software and government has data about who goes through an intervention, and then they have access to the outcome data in the form of tax files and some of the T4 kind of information about who works in which industries. So there's other stuff happening. So when we think about what can we do with our individual organizations to use data, I think much more about communities producing evidence than I do about individual organizations producing evidence. And I think there's a lot of really good reflection on, is it possible, like what's feasible and possible to do evaluations when you're a small organization with a limited number of people who you work with. Even the statistical significance of impact measurement is going to be affected by your cohort size. So I think there's good to organizations that are at the smaller size, they can evaluate the expected, more of the activities than they can the impact. And so to separate really your operational data needs and what would help you be more effective as an organization from measuring your impact as an organization. And it's hard because I know all this stuff is driven by funders and driven by fundraising, and this need to show our impact, which I think is still, we're not in the right place with it yet. As much as funders are exhorting us to show our impact, I don't think we have the tools to do that in a lot of cases. And certainly I don't think we have the funding. So that's my answer.
Thank you for that, Mike. So, we only have 2 minutes left, and I just want to thank all the panelists for their incredible contributions. And there's definitely a lot, I think, to still unpack and explore and learn. I'm reflecting on the plenary this morning and on knowing how many eggs were laid last month, but not having data on the nonprofit sector, which also somebody reflected on in the chat. So I think this conversation is really timely, and I hope folks can take some time to look at some of the links and continue to learn from each other as we sort of forge into this brave new world together. So thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thanks.